Okay, there we go. I think we're ready to go now. Okay. One more person's coming in. Okay. Hassam, do you have access to let people into the room?
Yes, I do. It gives me the option. I think
okay.
I could. Yeah.
Okay, when I'm speaking, do you mind just letting people into the room while I give the introduction?
Sure thing. Okay.
Okay, awesome. Thank you. Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you all for waiting. My name is Saba, and I'm a member of the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies at SFU, the organization hosting today's event. I would like to begin by respectfully acknowledging that the land on which we gather is the traditional and unceded territory of the Semiahmoo, Katsi, Coquitlam, Kwantlen, Kaikat, and Tawasin First Nations, also known as Surrey, BC. We recognize that we are uninvited guests, and our acknowledgement of the land is our declaration of our collective responsibility to this place and its peoples, histories, rights, and presence. Lastly, we also recognize the adverse impacts of colonialism and the ongoing colonial practices which continue to harm Indigenous peoples today. So a little bit about the Center for Comparative Muslim Studies, also known as CCMS, for those of you who are unfamiliar with our work in our organization. So CCMS fosters academic and public discussions and understanding of Muslim societies and cultures. It shifts the analysis from the notion of a single religious landscape defined by the religion of Islam to that of Muslims of different experiences and interpretations as agents in the construction of their societies and cultures within specific contexts. CCMS conducts its activities in such a way as to serve SFU's mission of engaging the community and the world along with the core values of diversity, equity, and inclusion, and to enhance the reputation of the research and academic programs of the university. It achieves its purpose by curating events and programs that create a safe space for discussion, relationship building, and academic and community outreach. As some of you may know, October is Islamic History Month. Today's event is our last event for this month. In 2007, the Parliament of Canada proclaimed October as Islamic History Month. Islamic History Month aims to foster awareness regarding the history of Islam and Muslims and to recognize the pivotal contributions made by Canadian Muslims. This month also seeks to address the varying barriers and challenges such as Islamophobia Muslims in Canada continue to experience. Islamic History Month is a month of learning, reflecting, and celebrating in order to cultivate an equitable and inclusive space for all. So we're so excited to have Hassam Munir discuss this important topic today, which is the Pacific to the Prairie experience of Western Canadian Muslims and the history of them. So a little bit about today's topic. When many Muslim immigrants arrived at the ports in Eastern Canada in the early 20th century, they were often advised to keep moving west. This session will revisit early Muslim experiences in the prairies and the Pacific coast as peddlers, journalists, murder mystery solvers, musicians, and so much more. So a little bit about Hassam for those of you who are unfamiliar with him. Hassam Munir is a history researcher and educator. He is a fellow at the Yaqeen Institute for Islamic Research and founder of the iHistory multimedia project and an MA candidate in history at the University of Toronto. His research work focuses on the Muslim social and cultural history, the history of Muslims in the Americas, and the ways to make Muslim history accessible to the public through the use of new digital technologies. He has previously served as an archival researcher for the Ontario Historical Society and was recognized as an emerging historian at the 2017 Heritage Toronto Awards. His writing has appeared in many outlets, and he has lectured in the US, Canada, Uzbekistan, and virtually to audiences around the world. So I'd like to pass it off to Hassam to take it away now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Saba. Assalamu alaikum and good evening, everyone. Pleasure to give my first talk ever, I think, to an audience based in British Columbia, although I think we have people joining from across sort of Canada and perhaps other places as well, but for an organization, I should say, based in British Columbia. So really exciting. Also for me, it's not the last event for Islamic History Month. It's been a really long month, and there's been a lot of events, there's been a lot of great conversations. I'm sure this one will be as well, inshallah. I hope so. We'll make an effort from my end, and hopefully it proves to be so for everybody. And yeah, before I get into the topic, I'm going to just share my screen so that we can have that sort of facilitate our conversation as well, inshallah. All right, so Bismillah, let's start with this. So a few things you see here. You see the poster of the event. You also see my social media handles and my email. I would love to connect with you all on social media or through email, whatever you're comfortable with, so that we can take part in an ongoing learning journey, right? Because I was asked recently what my favorite topic is out of all the very interesting topics to talk about in Islamic history. My personal favorite is the history of Muslims in Canada. And part of that is, not only because I am a Canadian Muslim, and all of the amazing stories that come out of this maybe relatively neglected part of the global Muslim ummah, Muslim community, but it's also the fact that this is a unique challenge, right? To try to piece together this history. There aren't a lot of, sort of robust and comprehensive resources on this topic. So we have to keep digging. We have to keep sort of asking each other for our stories and try to slowly piece it together to come out with the larger story. And that's one of the reasons I like to connect, so that we have that relationship established by which I will, periodically share things on social media. Hey, I just found this about Muslims in BC and Muslims in Ontario, etc. And then somebody will respond and say, hey, I've heard something related to this, or, I have some information that could sort of add some insight to what you just found, etc. So it becomes a great collective effort as we try to piece together our stories. And just with the numbers that came out from last year's census, the numbers came out yesterday from the census that was taken in 2021. Every 10 years, the government of Canada asks questions about religion. So the last time we got numbers about religion and the religious diversity in Canada was in 2011. And a lot has changed since then, right? We live in a very fast-paced world. So in 2021, we got the numbers. Nearly 1 in every 20 Canadians self-identifies as a Muslim, right? Nearly 5% of the population. That's way more than the United States percentage-wise. And that's pretty much on par with the United Kingdom. And also, sorry, can we please mute ourselves if we are not the presenter? That would be really appreciated. Also, we have about, that percentage translates into about 1.8 million Muslims, or people who self-identify themselves as Muslims in Canada. And that's not just a number that can be used for like statistical, analysis and breakdown and comparison to like other sort of traditions and what's the fastest growing religion in Canada and all those kinds of things. But I think, to me, more importantly, that's 1.8 million stories of Muslims in this land in the present moment. And that's not even to mention those who have already passed on. Stories that we need to delve into, stories that we want to explore, and stories that we want to benefit from and then share with the rest of Canadian society to, help establish that presence that we have in this particular part of the world and in this particular society, a presence that comes with a spirit of contribution, right? A long tradition of working very, very diligently to make Canada a better place to live for all of the people who have settled here. So those are some of the things I want you to keep in mind, and also to keep in mind as we go through this presentation that this too, like I mentioned earlier, is not going to be a comprehensive presentation, right? We're not going to cover all of the history, all of the incredible stories, etc. In fact, I'd be very happy if all I was able to do was to give you like a really small glimpse right? Not even so much to educate you and give you a bunch of names and dates and things like that, but the overall purpose for me actually would be to get you excited about local Muslim history in your particular region, particularly if you're in BC or Alberta or Saskatchewan or Manitoba. What is the local history of Muslims? What is the history of the masjid you go to? How was it established, right? What is the history of sort of bridge building and interfaith relations and Muslim participation in the wider society and these kind of things? These are important stories, right? And these are stories that we need to put out there, because they do help change the narrative, and they may help change the perspective of, a person who has been misguided about what Islam is or who Muslims are. And as we've seen in Canada, we're no strangers to the fact that not only can we have Islamophobia sort of in the systems, right, systemically, and sort of flare up in different ways in different places over time, but we can have horrific cases of Islamophobic violence, right, hate crimes against Muslims as well. And so we have to do our part for that reason as well. That's not the only reason. And in fact, I wouldn't even say that's our main motivation, but nevertheless, that's something important to keep in mind in terms of us sharing these stories. So with that very long preamble, thank you for being patient through that. Let's get into the presentation itself. So we can see some numbers here. I'm just going to move this thing out of the way if I can. Okay, there we go. You can actually see two things going on here, right? The first is you see the GIF at the bottom, which kind of shows the development of the provinces of the region that we're talking about over time. So as we go through time, Canada is developing into the political geography, the map that we are familiar with today, the 10 provinces, the 3 territories, etc. And we're focusing on 4 provinces in Western Canada in particular today, but it's just as important to keep in mind, and maybe a topic for another conversation, the territories up in the north as well. And I also want you to pay attention, so you can pay attention to the map and see, because as we'll discuss the places Muslims settled in, how that region was developing geographically. And at the top, you can see the population growth, and specifically the population growth that was reported, that was recorded about Muslims present in that region. So you see Manitoba, 1901, we are aware of 1 Muslim being present based on the records, but there may have been more, right? And in some of these cases, there may have been less, etc. So the reporting isn't exact. There can be sort of like, it can be off a little bit, but you see the numbers there for Saskatchewan, Alberta, and British Columbia as well, and you see the growth, right? Starting in 1901 at the turn of the century, coming into the 20th century, and you see the gradual growth. In some cases, it's going to take off more quickly, particularly in the cases of Alberta and British Columbia. You see the numbers grow to a larger extent and also more quickly than they do in Manitoba and Saskatchewan. Right, so keep these numbers in mind as well. But again, each number represents a story, right? Each number represents a rich story full of insights, full of inspiration for us as Canadian Muslims, and just generally as Canadians today, about people of a particular background with particular values and beliefs and principles and ways of life, and how they came to Canada and contributed to making Canada the nation that it is today. So starting with British Columbia, we'll start in the westernmost part of Canada for our purposes, which is British Columbia, and then make our way eastwards. Early Muslim arrivals to British Columbia were from India and Fiji. India was ruled by the British, so was Fiji, right? So these are both sort of part of the British Empire at that particular time around the turn of the 20th century, which is pretty much the period we're going to be focusing on for the most part. So we have many migrants coming, especially from the northwestern regions of the Indian subcontinent, and specifically Punjab, and to a lesser extent Gujarat. And of course, all of this is ruled by the British at that time. One of the earliest arrivals who had sort of a long-standing presence there was Amanat Ali Khan. He wasn't the first, by the way. There were Muslims present before him, in British Columbia as well. Mostly they had arrived from India. But he was a person whose story we know in quite a bit of detail, and he left a lot of information for us about the community that he found himself coming into, the very small community, but still a very vibrant community. Important to keep in mind the role of geography here. On the East Coast, there's many ports, right? If somebody was arriving and they wanted to settle somewhere in the Americas, they might end up in Maryland, they might end up in Boston, in New York, right? They might end up in Charleston, they might end up in Halifax or Montreal, et cetera. So depending on where you landed or where your ship basically stopped or where you were able to have the opportunity to get off, that would sort of really determine your route. But on the West Coast, there weren't as many ports, right? So you had sort of, Los Angeles and San Francisco, and you had your, Seattle and Vancouver. And Vancouver was actually one of the more important ones on the West Coast, even for people whose final destination was the United States, right? So this is part of the reason why there was so much attraction to that particular sort of opportunity there. Okay. So Amanat Ali Khan, his son, it estimates that the population of South Asians in BC was, as you see the breakdown there, in that early period. So we can say about the first 2 decades of the 20th century, or about 100 years ago from our time, the people who were coming from the Indian subcontinent were 58% Sikh, 40% Muslim, and 2% Hindu. And there's a specific reason he describes why this particular kind of breakdown, because the Sikhs and the Muslims in Punjab were mostly farmers, and the Hindus were more involved in business, and they were shop owners and things like that. And so for the Sikhs and the Muslims, it was easier to seek opportunity, especially any kind of agricultural or labor opportunity in different parts of the world, including in Canada, in British Columbia, right, through chain migration. So one person from a particular village would arrive, they would send letters back home about what a great success it was, and then others would take the opportunity. They were inspired by the letters to come and take the risk as well and come and try to settle here. Whereas for the Hindus of that particular region at that time, because they were business people and they were shop owners, etc., they would not take as much of a risk to come here and not know if they're going to be able to do business here, or to pursue their particular way of life. Whereas agriculture, there was a bit more of a certainty that you could adapt as long as you had land and as long as you had that opportunity. So that helps explain part of the disparity. A lot of the Muslims, they worked at Fraser Mills along the Fraser River, right? It was the largest sawmill in Canada at that time. And at a certain point in the early 20th century, you had 25 Muslims working there, and they would pray together regularly. The Muslims also had close connections with Muslims and industries in Seattle, as well as in California. So along the West Coast, there's a lot of traveling. There's a lot of back and forth happening across the border. And for example, Amanat Ali Khan himself at some point would own a grape farm in Northern California, right? So a lot of the Muslims who worked in Vancouver for a while, they're buried in graveyards in places like Sacramento and other places. So there's a lot of population sort of movement happening of the Muslims and others who are arriving here as well. And part of that was due to the disruptions in livelihood because of the First World War. Canada would go to war, but the United States would not go to war until many years later, right? Until 3 years later. So Canada would join in 1914. The US wouldn't get involved until 1917. And so that's part of the reason why, once the focus of the industries shifted, in Canada, many of the Muslims who had intended perhaps to settle in Canada, they found that there would be more opportunities in the United States where the industries were continuing undeterred. And so they moved to the United States, to Seattle or California. And then, of course, the Great Depression. So in the case of Amanat Ali Khan, for example, his grape farm where he was growing grapes in Northern California, due to the difficult economic situation of the Great Depression and the changes in, the demand for things and supply, etc., he had to shut down the farm and basically come back up into Canada. Other Muslims were arriving from Fiji as well, as we mentioned. Usman Ali being a famous example, or relatively well-known example, I should say. He arrived in 1964 and he was the founding secretary of the BCMA, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the British Columbia Muslim Association. And there were many others as well, including some examples who had arrived from Fiji much, much earlier on. And one of the things that they counted on was the entry, the access provided by the fact that they were coming as not citizens of the British Empire per se, but because of the Commonwealth, that Canada was also part of the Commonwealth that that was ruling over the Indian subcontinent, that was ruling, over Fiji as well. Whoever is drawing on the screen, can I just request, if you're an adult, please, I'm sure you know better. If you're a child, please get a parent to kind of take care of you, or whatever the case might be. I would just really appreciate it. And finally, the first mosque is established in the early 1960s in British Columbia, right? Through these Muslims coming from different parts of the world. There's a few people taking advantage of the opportunities in industry and agriculture. Some of them are Turkish, some of them are Egyptian. So you have a good mix, right? And there's actually a quote from the CBC report basically said that if you want to see a bouquet, go to the Richmond Mosque, right? And this was like way back in the day that he kind of recorded this, that there's such a diversity in the Muslim community at that particular time, it's noticeable in the wider society as well, that these people are united by their faith, but of course they are very much, they're very much diverse among themselves. And the Friday prayer was observed at that mosque, and this is before some of the more well-known mosques were developed in British Columbia. But on April 1st, Good Friday in 1965 was when they had the first Jummah prayer there. An important person to keep in mind in BC Muslim history is this individual named Hussein Rahim. I'm not sure if any of the BC people here, or if you live in Vancouver, if you've been to the Hussein Rahim Plaza, you can see there's a very nice part of Vancouver, and there's a plaque kind of commemorating Hussein Rahim there. And of course, the plaza is named after him. Hussein Rahim came to British Columbia at a time in 1912 when basically, and he had actually come before that, but his exact itinerary isn't known about where he was at a particular moment, because he came in secretly, because a ban had been imposed on migrants coming from South Asia into Canada. And that was part of British India, the British Indian government's way to control people who were sort of political dissidents, right? So they didn't want people fighting for independence for India to spread all over the world and then find support and, cause what were considered problems in other places, etc. And Hussein Rahim was one of them. And, he kind of was a very enigmatic figure to the point that he, even his exact identity and whether he was even Muslim is not confirmed. There's some theories that he may have been a Hindu using a Muslim name, etc. And part of that confusion comes from the fact that the Canadian journalists and authorities would describe anyone from India as a Hindu, as you can see in this newspaper clipping here, which is about Hussein Rahim, which basically says that he's going to be arrested for voting. Right. So he was actually accused of all things of casting a vote in the local election in 1912. And he faced up to 14 years in jail and a $10,000 fine for that. And you can imagine, forget the 14 years in jail, which is absurd enough, but $10,000, at the time was a huge, huge amount of money. But the idea was that he wasn't even supposed to be in the country, let alone be sort of voting in the election, right? So he was basically accused of committing fraud and producing fraudulent identity and voting in the election. Ultimately, the case against him was dropped because no sufficient evidence could be found, but he was a nuisance for Canadian authorities. So you find like a lot of Canadian immigration officials, etc., kind of commenting on who is this person, Hussein Rahim, because he was very active, he was very vocal. He established the first newspaper for the Indian community in British Columbia, right? So in 1914, it was called the Hindustani. So he's essentially the first Muslim journalist in Canada. He became involved in the socialist parties that were active in the region at that time. And he was huge on sort of bridge building, especially between the Sikhs and the Hindus and the Muslims, all of common origin from British India. And that would be important because he led the effort to give refuge to the 400 or so Indians who came on the Kamagata Maru. Kamagata Maru was a Japanese steamship which arrived in Vancouver's harbor in 1914. And it was mostly Sikhs, but there were Hindus and 27 Muslims on board as well. They had all come, they were all of Indian background. They had come from different places seeking political refuge. Basically, they were persecuted in British India, and they thought that they might find a safe haven in Canada if they were to reach it. So they got on this Japanese ship and reached the port in Vancouver. And before them, others had been able to sort of sneak in, or they had been given an exception and allowed into the country. But this time, the Canadian authorities basically put their foot down and said, "No way, we are not going to let these people into Canada. They have to go back to India." You had people like Maulana Barkatullah. He was an educated sort of a Muslim and an Indian activist for independence. He was a professor at Tokyo University, and he used to write against the British Empire from his base in Tokyo. And there was some kind of difficulty that he faced there, so he was trying to move and tried to move to Canada instead. But he, like many others, after a few months of back and forth, and the Muslims and Sikhs and Hindus, they would work together to try to convince the government, the ones who were in Canada already, including Hussein Rahim. They would develop what were called shore committees and try to convince the government to let these people in because they were political refugees, but ultimately they were denied and turned away. And many of them had no choice but ultimately to go back to India, where of course the British authorities were waiting for them, and many of them were killed. They were shot point blank as soon as they got off the ship once they reached India, and others were put under house arrest, etc. So it was a way to teach a lesson that, if you're persecuted in British India, don't try to flee anywhere else. And of course, part of the responsibility for that injustice, a major part falls on the sort of discrimination and racist attitude of Canadian authorities. And this is why Prime Minister Justin Trudeau apologized for the Komagata Maru incident in Parliament in 2016 because of the disastrous consequences. But people like Hussein Rahim did their best to sort of be the social justice activists of their era and try to facilitate not just for the Muslims, but also for non-Muslims who were trying to find refuge in Canada at that time. Switching gears to Alberta a little bit, just to cover the other provinces to some extent, I actually want to talk about Lac La Biche, Alberta, which is a town that many people have not heard of, right? And it's an important town in North American Muslim history, just because of how much of the community congregated there. So you have around the turn of the century this wave of, or several waves, I should say, of migration from Lebanon, right? And so you have, for example, sayings like in London, Ontario, there's a village in Lebanon, there's more people from that village who live in London, Ontario than live in the village itself today, right? Because of how many descendants there are, et cetera. So you had these waves of, again, chain migration. One adventurous person would go through the difficult journey. The Ottoman Empire was sort of going through a tough situation. It was falling apart. People, especially young men, were looking for other opportunities in different parts of the world. They had heard of places. It was a globalized world. And so they would make their way towards the Americas, towards, the United States. And this is how you find Muslims kind of everywhere, right? Muslims building the Panama Canal, Muslims kind of mining in Bolivia, Muslims, in the coffee business in Brazil, Muslims in Canada, as we're talking about, right? All over the United States, et cetera. It was just all of these opportunities that were opening up. And in this part of the world, as part of the settler colonialist project, the governments needed people who were hardy, people who could work hard, people who were used to doing a lot of, difficult agricultural labor. And so it was a good match in that sense to give these people from the Middle East, Lebanese, Palestinians from Levant, or Sham, as we say in Arabic, right, from Syria, Jordan, Lebanon, and Palestine, give them that opportunity to come. So you have, the story of one particular person named Ali Abu Shahadi, whose picture you see here. And he actually was a young man, very young man, and he heard with his uncle about the Klondike Gold Rush, which was happening largely in BC. The gold rush, they found out that there's a place called Canada, and all of this gold has been discovered there. Like, there's so much gold. You know how stories get exaggerated. Like, you can imagine back in the day, information takes a long time to travel, and a lot of spicy details get added along the way. So, they are hearing about this Klondike Gold Rush, and they're like, this is an opportunity. So him and his uncle both come all the way to Canada, a very long and expensive and difficult journey that they invest everything they have into it. They come to Montreal. And when they get to Montreal, they find out that the Klondike Gold Rush actually ended years ago. So by the time the information that reached them, it was new information that had reached Lebanon, but the actual gold rush had ended years ago. This was how information traveled in the day. So they decided to try to take that opportunity, and try to see if they could find other opportunities. They had invested so much in getting here. So they continued to move west, right, through Manitoba. And again, like we mentioned in the description of the event, people would be encouraged to keep going west, right? It's like, keep moving west. That's where the opportunities are. That's where the government is freely giving away land for people to settle, right? That's where the railroad is being built. That's where they need people to sort of do things like chop down trees and work at sawmills and things like that. That's where all of the work is. So they would continue to be sent west, or encouraged to go west. So they went to Alberta, and to Manitoba, and then they went to Saskatchewan, and then Alberta. And then once they got to Alberta, they had become involved in peddling, which was basically, is like the dollar store of the day, in the sense that people lived in very remote communities, right? People lived on farms, so things were very far apart. There's not a lot of cars, right? And obviously there's no Amazon or anything like that. So you need things on a day-to-day basis, like your everyday essentials. So you had these people who would get a massive backpack, and they would fill it with things, and then they would just travel from community to community. They would be walking on foot, and some of the ones who got richer, they would get like a horse-drawn wagon basically, and go from community to community, selling things out of their wagon or out of their backpack, literally sometimes, walking these very long distances, you can imagine, in the Canadian weather and things like that, just because they didn't have many language skills. They couldn't get involved in certain industries, and this was something that they could easily get involved in. It didn't require a lot of investment, and it's just something that they could quickly learn to do and try to make them a home for themselves here in Canada. So that's what Ali Abu Shahade did. He's a teenager, right? And when he's 17 years old, his uncle says, I've had enough of this. I'm going back. So his uncle returns to Lebanon, and now you have this 17-year-old who chooses to stay in Canada. He says, I want to try and build my life here. And he will. So through peddling, he will become more and more successful, save some money, get involved in the fur trade. We'll talk more about Muslims in the fur trade in a second, in one of the other slides, right? And ultimately, he'll move to this town that's north of Alberta called Lac La Biche, which was basically one of the southernmost towns in the Mackenzie River network. So if you might know, Mackenzie River is one of the important rivers up in northern Canada. It connects to many other rivers, and rivers mean trade, right? It's a trade route. And Lac La Biche is at the southern end of this network. So you can actually visit it today, and you'll see the lake, and you'll kind of, once you see the lake and the town built right beside it, and you see how the lake connects to rivers and things like that, it'll make like immediate sense why they would establish themselves here. And then he would become very successful in Lac La Biche. He would emerge as a leader of that community. There were a lot of Ukrainians and French and Jewish people and people of many different backgrounds going through a similar process of trying to get involved in the fur trade and different kinds of trades, right? So he would sort of establish things like grain harvesters and become the official representative of the Ford Motor Company in that region of Alberta, etc. And him and others would establish, these kind of general stores. So they started off with peddling, and they would slowly expand to general stores. So you can see Hamdan and Ali. That's actually Ali, not Ali, but you would anglicize your name just to fit in with society and not stand out as much. And you can see these are actually like some of the Muslims who are in northern Alberta, not Ali Abu Shadi, but some of the others. And that became a hub, right? Because now he's the most successful Muslim in Alberta, and he's writing letters back home, and people are hearing about him, and they are following him to exactly where he is in Lac La Biche, Alberta, right? And today, if you go to Lac La Biche, first of all, worth mentioning that this is either the fourth or the fifth masjid in North America, right? In all of North America, the Lac La Biche Masjid. So you can go and see that. Although the building, of course, is upgraded. This is an original photo. So this was built very early on because of how many Muslims ended up settling there. If you go to the Lac La Biche Museum, you can basically like just see so much of Muslim and Arab cultural history in that museum. If you go to the graveyard, you'll see it just full of Muslim graves. And if you go to the main street that runs through Lac La Biche today, 90% of the businesses on that street are owned by Lebanese, right? And some Lebanese Christians, but mostly Lebanese Muslims as well. So it's like this very remote town, and oddly almost unheard of even among Muslims in Canada, and yet it's this sort of Muslim kind of hub, right, in Canada with so much history. And even in the present, like for the main street of a town to be 90% owned by Lebanese, and a significant part of that is Muslims, is not a small deal. So again, this is an introduction to Ali Abu Shahadi. There's a lot more fascinating details about his story. And through his story and similar stories, you are ultimately going to get the first mosque in Canada. Before the Lac La Biche Mosque, so before this one, you're going to get the Al Rashid Mosque built in Canada. Now, a few interesting things about this project to keep in mind. First of all, it was a dream for many of the people to build a mosque. And it's important for us to remember what a privilege a mosque is. And, maybe that would help us get some perspective and move past some of the very disheartening kind of politics and kind of challenges that we continue to face around mosques, even though we have so many today. And that's a privilege, and maybe we don't realize, and these stories can help us realize of how important a mosque is, and to not only build the physical structure, but also for us as a community to embody the spirit of what a mosque means, what it represents for us as a community. So you have in the Great Depression, when the Great Depression hits, many of the early Muslims who have arrived, they are peddlers, right? They are merchants, they are traders. Even if they're involved at a small scale, they're very heavily hit by the economic depression of the Great Depression in the 1930s. And so the first thing that they turn to, which is what we should turn to, right, in good times and in bad times, is the community. So they start to come together in Edmonton, which was sort of a central place for many of these people. They would gather in Edmonton and they would discuss, who's having a difficult situation in their business, who needs some more help, who can help, right? What other things do we need to focus on? We don't know when this economic, situation is going to end. And out of those conversations came this conversation came up that we need something as a community that represents us. We need a space for community building. We've been so isolated, right? And now that we all come together, we realize how many of us there are, right? And what we're collectively capable of, and how important it is that for the next generation, we now start to build instead of just, being focused on our own sort of day-to-day survival here. And that's where the idea of building the first masjid, through those meetings, it comes about. And the person given charge to lead that effort to establish the first mosque in Canada, which would be built in Edmonton, is this individual named Hilbi Hamdan over here. So she comes as a young woman from Lebanon. Her husband had come here earlier and gotten involved in the fur trade, and then went back to Lebanon and married her, and then brought her back. And they lived for several years in Fort Chippewan, which was pretty much an exclusively indigenous community. But like many of the fur traders, the Arab and the Jewish fur traders, they were establishing very close relationships with the indigenous peoples, right? What's the reason for that? It's because the Hudson's Bay Company had a monopoly on the fur trade for a very long time, which meant what? Which means that they relied on the traditional expertise of the indigenous hunters who trapped furs, but they would pay them basically nothing, pay them pennies, right, for their actual labor. And because there was a monopoly, the indigenous fur trappers didn't have any other outlet. They had nobody else to sell to. They would actually, not have much of an opportunity to negotiate or anything like that. They had to take the price, the cost that was offered by the Hudson's Bay Company. And so once the Jewish and Muslim and others as well, started to get involved in small scale fur trading operations, they offered an alternative to the indigenous peoples, that there could be some alternative trading happening, not just with the indigenous people. So more room for negotiation and more room for relationship building, and sometimes very close relationship building, as we'll see. So in this remote community, Fort Chippewan, this basically fur trading community, Hilbi Hamdan and her family would kind of, develop very close relationships with the indigenous peoples there. And when they ultimately left, the indigenous chief expressed a lot of sadness that this, Muslim family was leaving that community and moving to Edmonton. But they said that it was too difficult to, raise their children in such a remote part of northern Alberta, and so they had to move to Edmonton. And so they did, right? And she was someone who was very lively, very spirited, very full of sort of energy and enthusiasm. And the community noticed that. And they actually asked her to lead the project to establish the first mosque in Canada, because again, all of the merchants and the peddlers and others are too busy, right? They're trying to save their businesses, right? But they do recognize the value, the importance of this particular project, and they also recognize her skills. And she actually herself expressed some hesitation that she may not be the best person to do the task, because she said, I'm a woman and I don't speak very good English, etc. But the community reassured her that, despite those potential limitations, we still trust you to lead this project, and, gave her that sort of empowerment. And then she actually did. And so she is primarily, perhaps more than anyone else, responsible for establishing the first mosque in Canada. And many other interesting stories. It's designed by a Ukrainian, because Ukrainian architects were the people that were in the community who were most familiar with mosque architecture, and so they could take like basically a church building and kind of add some minarets. You can see it under construction over there with horses involved and things like that. To open, you had a very interesting mix of people come together. A Christian Arab mayor of Hanna, Alberta, was there for the opening ceremony. Abdullah Yusuf Ali, who was Shia, and he was a translator of the Quran, the famous translation of the Quran. He was present. He had come to Winnipeg a few times as part of an educational tour, so he became connected to the Canadian community. And so in 1938, when the mosque opened, he was there. One of the people who couldn't be there was Ali Tarrabain, who had this dream. He had been a person who really loved the idea of a mosque in Canada. He had lived here for many decades, but of course there was no masjid, and he had really pushed for this idea, and he passed away just a few weeks before the masjid actually opened. So the first event that ever happened at the first masjid in Canada, just outside of the building that was still under construction at the time, was the funeral of Ali Tarrabain, this person who had so passionately wanted a mosque to be built in Canada. You have Amin Ghanam here, who is known as Canada's King of the Fiddle, right? He's a musician. He was born in Saskatchewan in 1914, and then later on moved to Alberta, right? And became a very popular musician in Canadian history. He's known as Canada's King of the Fiddle, and he was also the first Quran teacher at the mosque for the children, right? So people stepped up to play different roles, whatever skills they had, whatever talents they had. The community came together and really put themselves as a community on the map in terms of a physical structure. They built this first masjid in Canada and opened it in 1938. There's a picture of the building, right? The finished masjid once it was ready, and a lot of stories sort of tied to it. They had an indigenous outreach program, in the 1960s. They had Muhammad Ali visit in the 1980s, right? So there's a lot of stories that have gone into this institution that is now very much part of Canadian history. And you can actually go to Fort Edmonton Park, which is sort of Edmonton's open air museum, and still go inside this original structure that was established in 1938. I know I'm going pretty long here and I'm saying a lot of things, but we're going to sort of get through this, and inshallah, we won't go longer than an hour for sure. Then we can open up and sort of have some conversation, inshallah. So Saskatchewan, of course, Muslims are settling there as well very early on. You have two people in particular to keep in mind. One of the earliest settlers of one of the communities that would emerge was Ali Hatum in Swift Current in 1909. So he was the first Muslim to sort of settle there. And in 1903, Muhammad Ali Tahini settled in Regina. And that's a very fascinating story of his, because he was actually a general in the Ottoman Empire. So while most people would come to Canada when they were sort of very young and looking for opportunities, he was very elderly. He was sort of a discharged general in the Ottoman army, and he made his way to North America, to North Dakota, and then he made it to Regina, where he had a corner store, and he would sell sort of dried fruits and nuts and dried goods and things like that. And there's a street in Regina. His grave in Regina is also known, but there's a street in Regina that's named Haney Street after him. Muhammad Ali Tahini, the first Muslim to settle in Regina in 1903. And just staying with the theme of Islamic History Month this year, which is food history, I wanted to mention this book. I highly recommend it. It's by Habib Saloom, who is an Arab Christian. And he and his family settled in southern Saskatchewan. And he says, at the time in the 1920s and 1930s, southern Saskatchewan was basically split. There was pretty much an equal number of Arab Christians and Arab Muslims settling in that region. And of course, the rest of the population was mostly indigenous people. So this is an interesting mix that you get. He himself is an Arab Christian, but he writes this book with full of recipes and also stories from his time growing up in southern Saskatchewan. Particularly during the Great Depression, right? So you see this quotation here that one of the foods that Muslims and Christians, Arabs introduced to Canada was the chickpea, right? Because during the Great Depression, not only was there an economic difficulty, but there was also a lot of drought and sort of natural disaster in that sense. Many of the crops failed and people sort of suffered because of that even more. But the people who had come from certain regions in the Middle East, they were familiar with this very hardy plant, right? The chickpea. It's very hardy. It can survive in very difficult conditions. So even in the droughts and things like that, the chickpea would survive and they would enjoy it in different forms, including hummus, right? They would be thriving on their dishes of chickpeas, as Habib Saloom says. And he says, today in parts of Saskatchewan, they are planted on a commercial scale. So now chickpeas are big business in Canada. And that's a food that was introduced by sort of the Muslim pioneers and the Christian pioneers as they came from that particular region of the Middle East. This photo here, just quickly, is very interesting because it shows both sides. You have a Muslim farming family in Saskatchewan, and you have a peddler who has come into their community, who's also Muslim, to sell them some goods, right? So you can see his wagon there. He's brought it. It's full of like things that you might need on a day-to-day basis, right? So he's either going to sell it to them, or they're going to have some kind of exchange. Maybe they'll just barter and take some goods in exchange for some food that they farmed, etc. So this was sort of the lifestyle at the time, and there were many Muslims who were involved in farming at that time. The Murder Mystery Solver, as promised, I want to recommend this book to you. It came out actually just last year by Richard Asmat Avid. who was the son of Ahmed Avid, who is a very famous person in the early history of Muslims in Canada. You know, his story is sort of widely known as somebody who came and settled here in Alberta in particular, but went through Manitoba and Saskatchewan. And a lot of people followed him here, right? Because how influential he was, not just in the community here, but also his stories became very popular in Lebanon, where he had originally come from, etc. So Richard is his son, and so he tells the stories of his father and just growing up, you know, in Alberta, that community. And this is one of my favorites, right? So he says that there was a cousin of his dad's, of Ahmed Avid, who had settled in Prince Albert, Saskatchewan. His name was Frank Amory, and that became Frank Elmer, but even that was most likely not his original name. Basically, what would happen is when you landed at a port, you know, you would say like, my name is Ali, and the immigration officials would just say, okay, you're Ali, right? Whatever name that they heard or they were familiar with, they would just change your name to that, just to make it easier for themselves and also for you to sort of just, you know, fit into the society. So Frank might have been something else, and same thing with Amity, might actually just be an original Arabic name. Whatever the case may be, the story is that this individual had the magical ability to find missing people, right? And it's very kind of, it sounds very odd. So there's a lot of actual newspaper clippings. There's a lot of like news articles about this, that police forces in Canada and the United States would call on him to help find missing people. So people would go missing, you know, they would be murdered or something like that, and the bodies couldn't be found, and he would have this ability to just locate, and also water. So when there was a drought, and people were trying to figure out the best place to dig a well, he was known as this person who kind of just showed up to a place, and he would walk over to a specific spot and say, you can dig here. And people came to trust him after a while, because wherever he said you should dig, you know, very often where he said you should dig, it would actually turn out to be a very good spot, and a lot of water would come out of there, right? So you have this story that Richard Awad is reporting, and is corroborated by newspaper clippings, etc. The news reports always told how Frank directed the police to specific locations where the missing people would be found. And when you go into detail in this book, when he describes it in detail, it's actually like very, like, it kind of shakes you up a little bit. Like, if it's, you know, you're like, if that's a true story, that is an incredible story, right? So Richard says, as a kid, Frank once came over from Saskatchewan and visited his family in Edmonton. So he actually asked, like, you know, like, this is very odd. Like, you know, how does it come to you? How do you know? And Frank was a very like kind of jolly kind of person. And he said, he laughed it off. And then he said more seriously that it's the power of God that gives him that ability, you know, saying it about himself. It's just like an ability that God has given him, right? So I highly recommend you get this book. It's full of like interesting stories like this. I think this one was the most interesting. And of course, this is just a summary of it. There's a lot more detail if you actually get the book and begin to read it. So highly suggest this book, Walk With Me, My Son. You and I Have Some Stories to Tell, by Richard Awad. This is the last major story I'm sort of going to focus on, and I think it's a fascinating one that ties a lot of the history, early history of Muslims in Western Canada together. You have this person named Ahmed Ali Farran, who became known as Peter Baker in Canada and got nicknamed Orange. So we'll talk about that in a second. And as you can see in the title there, he would go on to become the first Muslim elected in Canada. So what is his story, right? He does not want to serve in the Ottoman Empire. He is in Lebanon. He doesn't want to serve for the Ottoman army. There's a lot of conflict going on, so there's some conscription. He doesn't want to get involved in any of that. So basically, he runs away. He comes to the United States. He works in Boston and other places, sometimes in churches, whatever like labor job that he can get, he takes on. And ultimately, he finds his way through different cities in the United States, in British Columbia, right? So in 1918, he ends up in British Columbia, in this lumber camp in Hutton, again, chopping down trees. Later on, he moves to Prince Rupert on Princess Royal Island, right, where he works in a gold mine. And then later on after that, he moves to Vancouver. Then he finds work laying the tracks for what became known as BC Rail later on. So he's moving all over British Columbia, and, you know, recording his own story in detail. This is one of the very few books that we have, and it's not even widely available. But, thankfully we have it, of a person actually writing their memoir, a Muslim writing their memoir from that specific early period in Muslim history in Canada, and providing us with all this detail of their story in Canada. So in 1921, right, over 100 years ago now, he saved up a good amount of money from all this labor work that he does, and then he makes the mistake of getting into gambling, loses all the money, and he finds himself homeless on the island village of Alert Bay. I'm sure all of you who are in BC are more familiar with that than I am. So there's a Scottish lady named Mrs. McLean who offers to let him sleep in her home. And when he's ready to leave, she gives him $15 to sort of, help him out as he's leaving. Baker doesn't want to take it, right? Or Ferran, which is his actual name, he doesn't want to take it. But she kind of gives it to him and says, I have confidence that you'll send $15 when you start earning money again, you'll basically pay me back. So Baker, he does earn money, and he sends her $25 more than she had given him. And, throughout his life, he continued to mention his kindness when he found himself homeless on that remote island, in Alert Bay in British Columbia. And they never were in communication again, as far as we know. But Baker actually later meets a man, somewhere else in Canada, who tells him that there's this lady named Mrs. McLean in Alert Bay, who often talks about that there was a man once that she trusted. She trusted him, and he actually proved to be honest and sincere, right? So it's a very sort of heartwarming kind of story of the relationships and people going about their lives and helping each other out as Muslims as well were finding their way in Canadian territory. So here's a picture of Peter Baker in his much older age. He became involved in the fur trade as well, right? And that's something to reflect on in terms of Muslims. This whole presentation, there should be an underlying reflection about our role as settlers, right? Because the vast majority of us are settlers, and in a sense, all of us are. But of course, in the history of Muslims and Canada overall, there's other dynamics at work, including the transatlantic slave trade, right, which brought what are most likely the earliest Muslims to Canada in the late 1700s, but that's a story of Eastern Canada, so we won't go into it. So with those particular dynamics, and then also the dynamic that people were finding their way here, but not necessarily invested in any way or even aware of the fact that there were indigenous peoples, or the way that the emerging sort of Canadian government had treated them historically, or the British or French empires had the kind of relationships that they had that had put essentially a genocide in work of indigenous peoples in North America, etc. Right? So there wasn't necessarily much awareness of this, and certainly not of their own role as people contributing to this, up until the point likely when they first started engaging with these people, and especially when they got involved in the process of the fur trade. So that's not to excuse ourselves from the responsibilities as a community with our specific history, from the responsibilities from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and things like that. We have important sort of responsibilities that come out of that particular initiative. And that's important to keep in mind as we discuss this history as well, that we are, settlers, even though our dynamics as settlers in this land may be slightly different from those of people who came at other times from other places and from other backgrounds. All that being said, Peter Baker gets involved in the fur trade, and becomes very successful in the fur trade, although he faces a lot of difficulty. Again, the Hudson's Bay Company does not like that these Muslims and these Jews are basically coming in and becoming involved in their business and taking business away from them, essentially, right? And so he's actually accused of being a Jew, right? Because at the time, Islamophobia wasn't the hot thing in Canada. It was actually anti-Semitism, right, that was rampant in Canada at that particular time. And so to kind of dislodge him from his confident position in the fur trade, he was accused of being Jewish, and what that meant was that if you were Jewish, you were kind of a co-conspirator in the killing of Jesus Christ and things like that. So there was a lot of effort to basically get him out of the business by basically ruining his reputation. in the region, but he sort of overcame all of that. Then there were government policies that restricted his ability to trade with the indigenous people. So in 1926 specifically, he confronted the Interior Minister of Canada, Charles Stewart, in Edmonton, and asked about the unfair rules that sort of privileged the Hudson's Bay Company and disadvantaged these independent fur traders. And the Interior Minister of Canada replied, it wouldn't be necessary. The new rule wouldn't be necessary if it wasn't for those damn Syrians and Jews going around and fooling the poor Indians, right? And I don't know if there's another way to, be sort of so racist in so many different ways with so few words, right? So this was kind of the dynamic that some of these early Muslims in Alberta, in the Prairies, and going up into the Northwest Territories, these were the things that they had to deal with. Nevertheless, he persevered and he continued to explore different businesses. He got arrested a few times, again, on sort of trumped up charges, right? There was a lot of animosity towards him because he was so successful as a trader. And because he was sort of ingenious in ways. So one of the things that he did was he found a way to bring fresh oranges from Alberta up into the Northwest Territories, which took some time, but he found a way to package them in a way that they wouldn't actually go bad during the journey. So they were still fairly fresh when they got into the indigenous communities in the Northwest Territories. And later on, he brought orange soda as well. And so the indigenous peoples of that region, the Slavi-speaking indigenous Din peoples of that region, they actually nicknamed him Orange. So they started calling him Orange, had a very close relationship with him. And that's how in 1964, he was the first Muslim elected to public office in Canada from the Northwest Territories, right, of all places you would imagine. And he represented a mostly indigenous riding at that time. And he was in power for the next 3 years before he lost that seat. Last slide here. So we covered some of Saskatchewan, Alberta, British Columbia, Manitoba. I'm not going to go into really any detail at all, except that it was the crossroads, right? So many of the people were again coming on the eastern ports, right? They were landing in Halifax or Montreal usually, and they were being told to go west. And the first sort of significant communities, Muslim community that they would reach was in Winnipeg that was developing. And instead of giving you an outline of that history, there's just so many incredible stories there. I want to recommend this book that was published just a couple of years ago now, by Ismail Mukhtar. It's called Manitoba Muslims. It's a very thick book. It's full of all of these fascinating details about Muslim experiences going, very far back in Manitoba, as the title suggests, right up to the present moment. So it's full of a lot of fascinating details. And, if you can write a book like that about Manitoba, you can write a book like that about any other province. So hopefully maybe somebody in this audience will take up the task of just going and doing the interviews and going through the newspaper archives and, doing everything else that there is to do to put together a proper history of Muslims in British Columbia. I think that would be an incredible project, right? But just to give you a sense of some of the stories, right? When we think about all of the experiences Muslims have been through, this is from 1914, and this is probably the first known Muslim who was murdered in Canada. So he was a Muslim peddler. So again, we describe what peddling is. And he was a peddler and based in Brandon, Manitoba. And again, these people would walk alone in very difficult conditions, long distances, carrying a lot of sort of inventory literally on their backs, going from community to community. And his name was Alex, probably Ali, changed to Alex Sidi. And he left Brandon, and then he was not heard for 5 weeks, as you can see in this particular newspaper clipping. And later on, he was found dead. And we do know that one particular person was charged with his murder. He was young. He was only in his 20s, right? But we don't know what the particular nature of the charges or, the explanation for his murder was. But, just bringing together a complete history of Muslims in Canada, Western Canada, and other parts of Canada, we're going to have to dig out all of these stories, like I mentioned at the beginning, and sort of gradually bring them together. It's great to see that an effort is being made by Ismail Mukhtar in this case, for example, and by others. Hopefully this conversation that we had, this presentation. I know I spoke a lot, but instead of like the specific details or stories, the thing I want you to really take away, hopefully, is that you also have a story. Your family also has a story. Your community, you know, your friends, your people in your masjid, right? The elders in your masjid, these are all stories that are important to record. They're important to preserve, right? And they're important to share so that the wider society becomes more aware of who we are, right? And what we bring to the society in which we live and have brought since the very first people who shared our identity started to come to this land, right? So I'm going to stop there. We are at 59 minutes. Thank you so much for listening. I'm sure we'll have a great conversation in the Q&A. And please do reach out on social media or by email if you want to, you know, follow up and you don't get a chance in the Q&A on any aspect of this presentation. And thank you so much to the organizers for organizing this event and inviting me to participate. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hassam, for that very informative presentation. As you mentioned, it was not a comprehensive like history, of course, but it's a great starting point for people in BC to kind of start that conversation. So I really appreciated you doing that work for us, even though you're from the East Coast. So I really appreciate that. So yeah, I guess we could open up the floor to Q&A. So if you have a question, you can either raise your hand, I guess, or I can open up the chat. Yeah, I can do that. Okay, so the settings should be changed for people to message. Even like comments, I guess, are welcome. Somebody is asking, when was the first Islamic cemetery in Western Canada established?
That's a good question. I don't know the answer to it. And I was going to say I would assume in Edmonton, but that's not necessarily a good assumption to make, right? So that's a good question. That's something to look into. I'm not sure. The oldest overall cemetery section is in Canada is in Brantford, Ontario. Again, right, and that's the fascinating thing, that it might be in the most unlikely place, right? The place you wouldn't kind of guess in your first top 10 guesses. So the earliest section is in Brantford, Ontario, and the first dedicated Muslim cemetery is in Truro, Ontario. Truro, Nova Scotia, right? And that was established in the 1930s. So that's why I don't want to say Edmonton and just assume that it was likely there, because it might be the most completely randomly fascinating place in British Columbia or somewhere else. So that's something to look into.
Thank you. And then somebody else in the chat wrote, where was the first masjid built again?
The first masjid in Canada was built in, it was built in Edmonton, if that's what you were asking about, in 1938. So we're almost coming up to, well, I guess it's a few years away, right? But 100-year anniversary. But we're gonna have to make sure that we make some noise about that. And I think by then we'll have a lot more richer understanding of Muslim history in Canada as a whole, right? So again, this is very much like piecemeal kind of work, which is what makes it exciting, but also makes it like very painstaking, like to find like a single detail. It's just a lot of work.
We have a very interesting comment and question. I think this is really important. So I'm struck by the anti-Semitic comments leveled against Muslims in the fur trade context. What relationships were there between Muslims and Jews in the West? Were there any sorts of joint responses to racism and xenophobia in this era?
We do know of some interpersonal relationships, but no sort of response, right, to this, to kind of the systemic, even legislative action taken against, not sort of in wording, it wasn't sort of worded as we are trying to shut down Muslim and Jewish traders, but it was kind of obvious which communities or individuals of which backgrounds were going to be particularly affected by this, right? And then when they went to follow up and ask the question is when you get that very blatantly racist and discriminatory comment. So we do have, and I encourage you to look up Ahmad Awid, who I mentioned, right? Ahmad Ali Awid had a very close relationship with the Jewish community, and coming up as settlers together in Western Canada, including in Edmonton. So you have stories like Ahmad's house got flooded, and the Jewish sort of friends of his came to help him and his family get out of the house, and then hosted them, and their children grew up together, and even things like eating kosher meat and not necessarily endorsing that decision, right? But that was a decision that was made historically by the Muslims sometimes when halal meat was just not available anywhere, to maybe kind of rely on kosher rules and things like that. So we have some evidence of interpersonal relations, and specifically you can check out that CBC article. There's a CBC article basically about Ahmad Awid's relationship with some of his Jewish friends. So I encourage you to kind of look into that.
And we have a couple of questions, I guess, like clarifications, like who was the first Muslim that came to Canada?
Sorry. First Muslim that came to Canada. I would love to know, right? So the further back we go in history, the more challenging it gets, and particularly when we get into the dynamic of, like I mentioned, the transatlantic slave trade, right? So in those cases, we say Muslim with an asterisk because we don't know if people who went through a disruptive process like that self-identified as a Muslim, right? And we don't want to necessarily assume or ascribe, a Muslim identity or belief to them, right? They may have had other beliefs, so it can get like pretty messy. So in that sense, the first Muslim or person of Muslim background or Muslim with an asterisk would be Richard Pierrepoint, who was from Senegal, from a sort of heavily Muslim influenced culture, but also including non-Muslims in Senegal at that time. And he was enslaved at the age of 16 and brought to Maryland in the United States. And then he was, during the American Revolutionary War, his slave owner was somebody who remained loyal to the British as the Americans were fighting for their independence. And so they retreated as they continued to fight, and he was offered his freedom if he contributed to the fight. So they went back to Niagara Falls, and that's where the border would be established, and then to different places in Ontario, St. Catharines and Hamilton, and places you may have heard of, right? He came to this small town for a little bit that was called Muddy York. Nobody liked it because it was really dirty and stuff like that, and it would one day become known as Toronto, right, for a little bit as well. All this is happening in the late 1700s and the early 1800s, and he was involved in the Underground Railroad, helping other enslaved people in the United States escape. But again, like there's some indications that maybe he retained his Muslim faith, maybe he had his Muslim faith at some point, but again, it's very difficult to actually know for sure. And it's important to have that humility when we're discussing those cases as well. And with most of this history, right, we may be wildly misrepresenting it or misinterpreting it, and we try our best and we maintain the humility at the end of the day to say that this is the best we could reconstruct, and maybe the actual story, the real experience was quite different from this, right? So but Richard Pierrepoint is the name to keep in mind, and you can actually read a book about him written by two brothers who were from the town which he established, Fergus, Ontario. So the book is it's called A Stolen Life, Searching for Richard Pierrepoint, A Stolen Life, right? So by David and Peter Mailer. So please do look into that. I would encourage you.
Hassam, do you mind just putting that in the chat maybe? So if anybody wanted to.
Yeah, I just I have like a bunch of private direct messages in the chat. How
Okay.
old was Richard before he passed away? Passed away in 1938. I believe he was in his 70s or 80s. He was quite old, but I can't remember his exact birth date. But I know he passed away in 1838. So we could kind of maybe reverse estimate that. But good question. So I'll put the name of that in the chat, and in the meantime, maybe we can get to the next question if like to
There's
do
one
that.
in like the main chat, I guess. So was there ever a trend where Muslims tried to move back home in Canadian history?
All right, just give me a second. I just want to make sure I find the book,
Okay, no problem.
Stolen Life. All right, so if I copy paste this. These are great questions, by the way. I really appreciate you guys kind of engaging in this way. So I'm going to post a link, a Google link that would take you to the book if you were to click it. Hopefully that works. And sorry, the question was, what did people ever move away or move back home, right?
Yeah.
Yes, and in fact, particularly in BC, you know, when you come as an immigrant, and in those days, there's no community, there's no place for you to fit in, there's no connection, right? You can't just like kind of video call your family back home or something like that. It's very, very difficult. So for a lot of those people who were coming, the idea was that we are going to try to make some money, right, which we can use to build up our family or you know, our wealth that we can use back home, and then we're going to go back. We're actually not going to stay here, right? And so that was the idea for many people. To be honest, that was the idea for my family, and we only came here like 22 years ago, right, to Canada. So it's been the sort of part of that immigrant experience, or moving to other places, having like Canada was a temporary destination for some people, right? Like we said, they would move to Seattle or to California or to other places. They would constantly be moving around. The border wasn't as much of an issue, right, in those days. So yes, like many of the people, they came with the intention that they would make some money and try to build something, and maybe just for adventure, right? Many of these are young people, right? Young couples or young men just coming, and they've heard about the world. It's a globalizing world, right? They maybe seen a movie about America or something like that once in their lifetime, and they want to experience it. But the thought is that we'll someday go home, right? And home at the time being wherever they had originally come from. And in some cases, they did, right? And there's actually a famous example of a Lebanese man who came and settled in Alberta and was involved in similarly with peddling and things like that. And he married an indigenous woman. And then they both moved back to Lebanon. And that indigenous Canadian woman was a member of that community, of that village in Lebanon for a very long time, and respected as an elder and just became fully part of that community, right? So in some cases it did happen, but in most cases people stayed on for one reason or another.
Okay, and then we got a couple. I think Dostum had his hand up for a bit. Dostum, do you want to?
Yeah.
Oh, can I talk through the audio?
Yeah, we can hear
Okay,
you. Yeah.
I just wanted, Assalamu alaikum, Hassam. Just wanted to thank you on behalf of the grade 5 students. We have some of the students from grade 5 from Ikra school, by the way. So some of the questions are actually from them. So thank you very much. Yeah, I just wanted to say that.
You're
Really,
welcome, and
really
thank you
enjoyed
so
it.
much for kind of bringing them on. I apologize. I completely forgot about the fact that there were going to be students. It was mentioned to me, but it slipped my mind. So I hope it wasn't too dense, right? I hope it wasn't too like, you know, overwhelming or information overload or something. I hope they had a interesting experience.
It was mentioned at the last minute. Yes, it was our fault. But Sam and I, we mentioned it to you at the last minute. But what we can do, I think maybe in the future, maybe we can have something for the grade 5, 6, and 7 students, because I think they are very interested, and it is very much integrated with the with our BC curriculum as well. Just exploring the first peoples, and not just the first people, the first newcomers. We're not just talking about the you know, the First Nations, but we're also talking about Asian, Chinese immigrants and Japanese immigrants. So I think this ties in very well with the curriculum that we're doing.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. And I'd be happy to participate and help out and play my role in whatever you think would work best for the students. So please,
Mhm.
you can get my contact maybe from Sabah, and we can pursue that way. Yeah.
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 Thank you very much. Again, Jazakallah khair.
We have a couple of questions here. What lessons should we take from today's presentation on Western Muslim Canadian history in regards to applying it to our current political atmosphere?
Sorry, could you repeat that? I
Oh,
kind of went over my head.
no, no, it's all good. What lessons should we take from today's presentation on Western Muslim Canadian history in regards to applying it to our current political atmosphere?
I muted myself. I think I don't know which specific political atmosphere you're referring to, so I'll just keep the answer very general as well, right? I'm not sure if it's like depending on where you are, a local situation or Canada as a whole, or the world or anything like that. But I do think that it's more important than ever. And I was just reading a comment somebody sent to me directly about taking the narrative approach, right, of telling our own particular stories. Because stories convey meaning in a way that facts don't necessarily, right? And that's something that's I think there's an increasing realization to it, that when we talk about any kind of issue that affects Canadian Muslims, right, whether it's Islamophobia, right, and we often focus in that conversation on Islamophobia on the statistics, right? This is how many women in Edmonton have tragically had their hijab pulled off in the past 3 years, right? And this is how many, Canada has had more Muslims killed than any other G7 country due to hate crimes in like the past 10 years or something like that. And while that has a powerful effect in conveying one aspect of the situation, I think what it doesn't do is establish sort of the opportunity for deep meaning making, deep connection making, right? And we see that when we advocate for certain causes. When there was a fire in the Notre Dame in France a few years ago, like, you did not actually have to go out and raise awareness and get all the celebrities involved. It was automatic. Why? Because that particular building, right, it's a physical structure, but that particular building means something to the people, right? There's already sort of a meaningful connection there. Whereas when we try as Muslims, for example, in Canada, to advocate for the Uyghur Muslims, for example, right? When we try to advocate for the Rohingya Muslims, or when we try to advocate for causes that are important to Muslims in Canada, or causes that are important in wider society, right? Or even for things like environmentalism, if we have stories, the power of stories goes much further than just sort of isolated and facts that have that don't come with that same kind of richness. So that's what I would say, I think. And that's what I was encouraging, like at the beginning and the presentation, that this is all about stories, right? We have, for example, emerging for the first time, MICA, the Muslim in Canada archives, right? We have a professionally run archive being established through the University of Toronto for the first time in Canada, where people are contributing their documents and their artifacts and things like that, so they can be, stored, and they can be digitized and made available for future resources, for future researchers, right? You have things like the Silk Road Institute, which is like the first professional theater company, Muslim theater company in Canada, right? You have all of these efforts in different places, finding different ways to tell Muslim stories. You have the Digital Sisterhood podcast, for example, right, of Muslims in Canada telling their stories, and the effects are obvious. It's obvious that these make an impact differently than other forms of communication. And I think that does kind of affect our politics as well, and our ability to make any kind, or pursue any kind of political change that we want to see in society. So tell your story, right? Tell your story. Make sure that your story gets out there, and make sure that it's your story. It doesn't have to be the story of the perfect Muslim, right? It doesn't have to be like, we don't have to pretend that we are perfect people. We can be flawed. Our communities are flawed, certainly, right? What we are trying our best, and we bring certain values and certain principles and certain ways of doing things to the table. And we believe that they can enrich the way Canadian society moves forward, not just for Muslims, but for all people. So sorry about the rant, but I do feel like very passionately about that. And that's what I would say to that question without knowing the specific context that was being referred to there.
No, I like how you tied it in from what you said from the beginning about the importance of storytelling. I feel like that also with indigenous methodologies being reemerged, I guess, and like our schooling, I think the storytelling aspect is very helpful. And okay, so I guess we have time for like one last question. So what did some of the Muslim indigenous relationships look like in the East Coast in the early days? So we can end off with that question.
In the East Coast,
Sorry.
like specifically?
Yeah, and the East Coast.
So that's an interesting phrasing for that question, because I think most of the relationship building actually happened in the West Coast, right? In the East Coast, there was some level of isolation. At least, again, there may be things that I'm not aware of yet, right? There may be histories that I'm not aware of. There may, I'm not saying that certainly something didn't happen, but certainly it's a lot more clear that there was engagement more on the West Coast, right? Al Rashid Mosque, again, like I mentioned, having a specific, indigenous outreach program, even to the point of taking indigenous leaders on a tour of Libya, a government-funded tour of Libya, to get sort of some affinity with Muslim culture in a different part of the world, etc., things like that. But on the East Coast, right? So you have, for example, the largest, probably one of the largest communities in London, Ontario, of Muslims, and right outside of that community, right outside in the neighboring town, you had a residential school, right? And there doesn't seem to have been much sort of awareness of, or maybe interest, or I'm not sure what the best word would be, but certainly the lack of connectivity there in terms of that, something like that happening right in a Muslim's backyard, and no sort of action that we're aware of. Again, things might have happened that we're not aware of, right? But nothing that we know of. So we have more local and more recent kind of initiatives in the East Coast, right, as the communities have developed. But I do think that there's nothing really too significant, too promising, that I would point out to and say that's an example of a way to do things. Whereas I think those of us on the East Coast actually have to learn from what was done in Alberta specifically that I'm aware of, but perhaps in other places in Western Canada as well, because it seems like the relationships built there were much closer and kind of flourishing. So it's kind of a non-answer, but it's a good question, right? Because that means we have to keep digging. Just because we haven't found something doesn't mean it doesn't exist, right? We have to keep digging.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Hassam, for your time. Yeah, we went like a couple of minutes over, but I'm glad we kept it mostly contained. And the questions were great. So thank you, everybody, so much. This event is recorded, and I will be posting it on our YouTube, which is CCMS SFE. Let's put that in the chat here. And we're also on Instagram for any of our future events. So just put that in there. Hassam, did you want to put in your information in the chat box if anybody wanted to reach out to you?
Sure thing, I'll do that. And especially want to point out to the people who kind of send me private messages. Sorry, I couldn't get through all of those. The chat's been moving and I was sort of focused in this direction. So I'll give you my email if you want to reach out. Putting it in the chat, please reach out, or Instagram or Twitter. All right, so please do connect and send me a message or send me an email, and happy to continue the conversation. And this is just the beginning of a learning journey, hopefully for all of us. We have a lot more to learn. Maybe some of the things said here may need to be corrected, right? But it's just part of the process. And hopefully we'll just keep continuing to build this body of knowledge. Thank you for facilitating this conversation and inviting me to be a part of it.
Stella.
All right. right. Assalamu alaikum.
Okay, assalamu alaikum. Thank you everybody for coming, and we'll hope to see you at our future CCMS events. Thank you.
Thank you.
Assalamu alaikum. Thank you.